Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining me here today on this short presentation and really a discovery on who is the real Jeanne d'Arc. And as our footnote in our documentary states, it's a story far more romantic and far more intriguing than history actually documents, because unfortunately certainly the character and personality of Jeanne d'Arc has been recorded incorrectly, which is a shame considering there is so much documented evidence and so many statements that has been recorded that Jeanne actually spoke about. But in order for us to discover who Jeanne really is, we have to look at her family circumstances, because the fairy tale story of being the daughter of a poor peasant farmer who could barely keep a roof above his head is also incorrect. So if you've got any comments to make, please make the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I possibly can, and perhaps we can throw a few ideas around. But to begin with, Jacques d'Arc, her father, certainly wasn't a peasant. He was a vavasseur and a doyen. A vavasseur is somebody who's a low-grade noble. They're not peasants, but they're not in the higher echelons either, but they are low-grade nobles. He owned acres and acres of land, something around 50 acres of land, I think, or 50 hectares. It's in the documentary. Anyway, and he also leased land off of a landlord. And you can't do this if you're a peasant and you've got no collateral, just like today. You've got to have collateral. So he certainly had collateral. We know that he had savings, which is quite rare back in that day. And we also know that along with a partner of his who did put in the larger amount of money, it's fair to say, they bought at the auction the Chateau de Lille, which we get into a little bit more about. But the point is, like everything else, once the hammer went down, you purchased it. There was no, okay, I've got to go and get a loan from somewhere. He had the money with his partner to purchase this. And there's an interesting aspect to the Chateau de Lille. But Jeanne lived in the only stone house in the village. And this must tell you something. She must have known that her status was a little bit higher than the rest of the people, because they lived basically in huts put together by chopping trees down and so on and so forth. But they lived in this stone building, which still exists today at Domremy-la-Pucelle. So they owned all this land. And also we know that with Jacques d'Arc, he was the tax collector. He had to take the collected taxes to the big town of Baudricourt and hand the money over to Robert de Baudricourt. Now, it's inconceivable that Jeanne or any of the family from time to time didn't go with him. And she would have had to have ridden on horseback. And the reason I mention this is because the historic story of Jeanne is that she claims that, I'm just a poor girl, I know nothing about riding horses. She would have had to have known how to ride a horse for other reasons I'll explain. So she would have gone from time to time to Baudricourt, and she would have understood and learnt the language of nobility. So, of course, if she went once, then maybe not. But if she went several times, she'd have certainly understood the language of nobility. Jacques d'Arc also was responsible for settling disputes amongst the villagers in Domremy, and we know that he represented the people of Domremy in 2 court cases in the bigger courts in the big administrative towns. So he was no slouch. He knew his stuff. And again, there was no television or radio, and pretty much like it was up until about the 1940s, people would sit round the table and talk. And Jeanne would have also, and the rest of the family, got to know a certain amount of understanding about law and how it worked, and a certain amount of language of law. And also Dr. Anne Lester, who's a professor in medieval history, who's in the documentary, tells us also that, you know, the women weren't passive bystanders. They would get together and chat and talk about what their husbands were up to, what they were doing, and would encourage their husbands and advise their husbands also. So Jeanne would have got an idea of exactly what's going on in and around this environment. So we also know that Jacques d'Arc was responsible for the defence of Domremy, so he had to have had some form of military training in order to do this. And so we can assume, actually, quite logically and reasonably, that Jeanne would have picked up some of her military prowess from her father. The Schiller Institute also writes about an article on a book that was written about Jeanne, calling her a military genius, which goes completely against the grain in the history text, who say that she was militarily naive. Well, I think the proof is in the pudding. As they say, she was far from militarily naive. So she would have picked this all up. Now, in defence of the village of Domremy, when they knew there was an advance of bandits or an invading army, Jeanne would take, along with the others, the livestock, the children and the women, and take them to the Chateau de Lille. It was a chateau that was surrounded by a moat and a drawbridge, and so it was quite safe. And these bandits and invading armies, it wasn't worth their while to try and break into that chateau. There was easier fish to fry elsewhere, so they would remain there sometimes for up to 2 weeks until the coast was clear for them to return home. So the point is, she wouldn't have walked there, wouldn't have run there. She'd have had to have done it on a horse. So she did know how to ride a horse, and bear in mind that whilst her duty was at home with her mother, which we'll get onto very shortly, she did say that from time to time that she would help her father in the fields. Now remember, these fields were massive, and they were almost like prairies, and it would have been very dangerous for a young girl to be out in the middle of a field in the middle of nowhere without any form of transport to allow her to have a hasty retreat if she needed it. So she must have had a horse and known how to ride it. So moving on to Jeanne's mother, Isabelle Vouton. Isabelle Vouton is another character that certainly wasn't just a peasant lady. She was the sister of the secretary of the church in Vouton. Now, to become the secretary of a church, you have to learn to read and write, and you don't learn to read and write if you're a peasant. So she also come from some standing in society. She was also a landowner in her own right. She was given 5 acres of land, and we presume it was a dowry for when she married Jacques d'Arc. So Isabelle Vouton was a very, very pious lady, a very religious lady, and she was responsible for teaching Jeanne prayers and house duties and learning how to spin, etc. She was so pious, in fact, that she said before she dies she wanted to see the seat of God on earth, i.e. the Vatican. And so she actually made the 1,200 kilometre journey to the Vatican. She wouldn't have had a horse because that would have presented problems in feeding the horse, cleaning the horse, keeping it in a stable. There was also the danger of bandits, thieves, Her horse might have been robbed from her, money robbed from her. So it was a very dangerous road. And, you know, she would have had to have slept rough quite a lot of the time, or found a stable to rest her head in. But she had a lot of courage and a lot of determination, and she made this journey and made it back. Now, the people of Domremy were so in awe of her that they renamed her Isabelle Romee, Isabel of Rome. But what does this tell us about Jeanne? We know this is where she got her prayers from. That's clear. And she learnt religion from her mother. We can also see that from her mother, Jeanne had a tremendous amount of courage, a tremendous amount of determination, which she would have learnt from her mother also. And the entrepreneurial spirit of her mother and her father to achieve the things that she wanted to achieve. So as you can see, when we gather all this information together, we can clearly see that the Dark family weren't no ordinary people. And Jeanne, she had in her mind, had in an idea in her head, her status. As we mentioned, she would have understood a bit about nobility, understood a bit about law, understood some of the military from her father. She got a religious understanding from her mother. She got her courage from her mother, the entrepreneurial spirit from her mother also. All of this makes a completely different story to the story that we've been led to believe about her. So as we just sort of sidestep just a little bit, and we talk about her sister Catherine, because once again we see the Dach family marrying into society, this time someone of a slightly higher standing, because Catherine married the son of the mayor of Grieux, which was the neighbouring village. It still exists today. And because it was a higher village, as it were, administratively, she actually married into a higher status than our family. But what it actually did was raise the status of the Dark family also. So now they were, even though officially Vazavers, they were also now getting higher and higher up the ladder of nobility. However, the King of France, after the war was won, did give them full nobility. And so Jacques could be called Lord. He was allowed to carry a sword and all the rest of it. But we're digressing just a little bit from that. To finish off with Isabelle Romee. Isabelle Romee was a master wordsmith. And if you go to watch the documentary, which you can find at our website, the address is just below me there. At the end, we hear of the testimony that Isabelle gave at the trial of nullification in order to get her daughter's good name restored. This text, I challenge you, people who were educated in the 21st century, who could read and write, I challenge you to write a better text than what was written here. It's so eloquent and so much to the point. She was a master wordsmith. And we also know that Jeanne was a master wordsmith, and she must have got this from her mother. When we look at the letters that she had dictated to the King of England and also to the French people and also to Charles the Dauphin at the time, it's really hard to believe that this come from an uneducated girl. Yes, she had no academic training whatsoever, but to say she was uneducated, I question that very much. I think she was very well educated, even though she couldn't read or write. It was nothing unusual at that time. So there we are. That's about all I have for you today about Jeanne. I hope that gives you a little bit of a better understanding of who she was. And then perhaps we can, as we go along, we can do a little bit more on this. So please leave some comments. As I say, I'll get to you when I can. We got one more channeled message coming along on the 21st of December, and that'll be the last one for the year. And then I think we start the table tipping again in the new year. So anyway, all that does is leave me to wish you a peaceful time and a peaceful new year if we don't hear from you. This is Mike. Thank you for watching. Signing off. Bye bye for now.